The first question that we're asking everybody, and it's a little different depending on whether it's friends or family, is how they knew Johnny Mercer or what their connection to the family was. So can you tell me a little bit about what connection you had, how you knew Mercer and the Mercer family?
Well, I went to work with the Mercer family immediately after graduating from Savannah High School. I had a scholarship offered to play basketball at Georgia Southern, but I had a brother working his way through what's now Georgia State University, and another brother playing football at Mercer University. And we were in the depth of the Depression, so somebody had to go to work, and that was I. So I went to work with the Mercer Insurance Agency, and the companion company was Mercer Realty Company. Johnny Mercer's father, G.A. Mercer, was still alive at that time. My immediate superior was Walter Mercer, Johnny's brother.
Okay.
This is 1932.
And you stayed with the company for a long, long time.
Well, except for 4.5 years in naval intelligence during World War II. That was the only job I had. 50 years after I went to work, I took retirement. And except for the Navy duty during World War II, I was a Mercer slave, an honored slave. It was a great experience being with the family.
When did Mercer's father pass away, approximately? Was it in the 40s?
I think it must have been around 1940 or 41.
Okay. And Mercer had 3 half-brothers. Walter was one of them.
Walter,
were the others part of the firm too?
George Mercer Jr. and Hugh Mercer.
Mm-hmm.
And Hugh Mercer's birth, Mrs. Walter Mercer, her family name was Walter. She died at Hugh's childbirth. A couple of years later, Mr. Mercer married his secretary, a lovely lady, Lillian Susevich.
What did the Susevich family do?
The Susevich was a large family. I don't know the men's side of the family, but Mrs. Mercer's sister, Annie Rivers, was the first public nurse in Chatham County. And of course, Walter Rivers was Johnny's very close buddy. They were cousins, but they were almost like cousins. I mean, brothers. They did everything together, including stowing away on the ship to go to New York, etc.
We've heard they had a lot of fun together.
Yeah.
When did you first meet Johnny Mercer?
Well, Johnny, of course, at that time was just getting involved in Broadway in New York. He was trying to be a stage actor, but he wasn't cutting the mustard there. But he met his lovely wife, Ginger, married, and then he went into the lyric writing with Paul Whiteman, and it took off from there. But then he would come down to visit his parents from time to time, and when he did, he always would come by the office, and of course, he liked to just shake hands with everybody, the new clerks and the old timers, and he was a buddy when he got to the office. He was like a family to everybody. He was very warm.
So you first met him just when he would come to visit the office?
Yes, yes.
And then over the years you came to know him better?
Over the years, he would always, if his brother was fishing at Vernon View, and then he would come see me. I was the head of the firm, and so he would check in with me and then visit with the others in the office. But when I would catch him in New York, I would get his unlisted number from his mother, and when I go to New York, I'd call him up, and on several occasions we got together and had quite a lot of fun. Not rowdy fun, but good fun being together.
What kind of things did you do?
Well, we can talk some funnies, Chris. I called him and told him his mother gave me the number, and I wanted to just say hello to him on the phone. He says, hello to hell. He says, get into a cab and tell him to bring you to so-and-so place, and I'll be waiting for you on the sidewalk. So I did precisely that, and after about $5 or $6 worth of cab fare, we found Johnny on the sidewalk, and he opens the door and said, "Don't get out." He says, "Take me back to the plaza." I said, "Johnny, I was calling you from the plaza." He said, "That's all right. We can visit on the way back." So we had it was brunch for him. He hadn't had breakfast because I had breakfast earlier. And after the brunch, he said, "What are you going to do now?" I said, "Well, my meeting's at 4 o'clock. And he said, "Well, you want to go down and see the rehearsal of Saratoga with me?" And I said, "Sure, I'd be delighted to." So we started walking down Fifth Avenue, and suddenly we stopped at the corner where there was a little church, and they referred to it as the church around the corner, little Episcopal church. And he says, "Nick, wait here a second. I want to go in and say a little prayer." And I said, "Well, Johnny, you blue-blooded Episcopalians don't let any other Christians go into your church." He stopped and pivoted around, and he came on, "Nick, I apologize honestly. Please forgive me. I shouldn't have said it that way." So we both went into church together. You know, he was an acolyte when he was growing up, and he sang in the boys' choir at the church. So he was really religiously trained and oriented. So when we came out of church, we started walking towards the rehearsal arena. And I said, "Well, I guess you prayed for a little help on Saratoga." And he said, "Nick, I have never asked the good Lord for anything. I just thanked him for all of the blessings that he has bestowed on me. Never said, 'Lord, please do this.' I always said, 'Thank you, Lord.'" Well, that's from his background, his father's background, his own background, but he was just adamant on the fact that his prayers are prayers of thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm. We've heard stories from other people with whom we've spoken that Mercer liked to listen to the music from the black churches in Savannah. Do you happen to know which churches, or have? I know you wouldn't have been there at the time, but did it ever come up, or do you know from anybody else?
Well, he also used to go to a lot of the music shops on West Broad Street, which is now Martin Luther King Boulevard, and they would have records on sale, which was appealing to the black music lover, and he would listen to him play, and he would engage in conversation with anybody in the music shops. If he went to the churches, it would probably have been the First African Baptist Church, and then the St. Philip's Church down on West Broad Street, most prominent church. But he always liked to engage in conversation, and that's why he picked up a lot of the Gullah dialect, or the island, West Indies island dialects that was predominant both in South Carolina and Georgia. They called it in South Carolina the Gullah, and down here we call it the Geechee. Mm-hmm. That's from the Geechee River.
How much time, or do you have any idea how much time he spent in South Carolina? I mean, I know it's not far away, but for a young man growing up in Savannah, you didn't go to
He didn't go to
areas.
South Carolina very much.
Okay.
No.
So he just picked it up from people he met?
Right. Also, near Vernon View, there was a colony of blacks who lived on the river, crabbed and shrimp and fish. It was really a fine colony. And from that colony came the present Justice, Supreme Court, Justice Thomas. That was at a place they called Pinpoint. Mm-hmm. And so many times, both Walter Mercer used to go there because he was one of the few agents in the insurance business who would dare insure properties owned by the Afro-Americans. Mm-hmm. And so he had cultivated all of this little colony. And then Johnny would go over sometimes buying wares, and when he went visiting, he would stay visiting. He'd like to chat with him and talk to him. And you feel that in his lyrics when you hear him say, "My mama done told me You know, where did he get that from? And lazy bones, sleeping in the sun. When you going to get your day's work done?
Right.
All of these expressions come right out of his dialogue with the black colony of Pinpoint.
It's nice to know because we knew he'd had contact, but we didn't specifically know where. Can you drive over? I mean, are there roads over to there, or is it a separate island that you would boat to?
No, it's attached to the mainland. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Have you been to the landings at Skidaway?
I drove past it when I went out to see Mrs. Mercer yesterday, right. Mrs. Klein.
Yeah. Now, that's right, because in that area there's a takeoff called Lehigh Avenue, and down Lehigh Avenue you get into the Pinpoint area.
Is it still there?
Oh yeah, it's still a colony of Afro-Americans. Yeah.
Nice. It's good to know. Getting back to the black churches, the story specifically that we were told, and this is from somebody who knew him when he lived in New York. The woman who told us this said that a good friend of his was Jimmy Downey, apparently another cousin, and that the two of them, the way she told it, would sit like outside or on a hill near these churches or near a church and listen to what was coming out the open windows, which sounded likely to us. But did you know Jimmy Downey? Or?
I didn't know Jimmy Downey.
Okay.
But you know, we had on what is now Ogeechee Road a very big, popular Afro-American congregation headed by Bishop Grace. They used to call him Daddy Grace, and they used to have services for several nights a week, and there was a lot of singing and clapping, and I think that Johnny also would venture down there with some friends and listen to, because they really had a traditional black song fest in their churches, besides the oratory, but they did a lot of singing, and Johnny would sneak down there too.
Well, that's what this woman told us, is that not that they were in necessarily, but they could hear, and that they could sit and enjoy and listen, without intruding or getting involved.
Well, he also used to, as a young lad, we used to have weekly dances down at Tybee Island at the Pavilion. Mm-hmm. And many times, rather than dancing, he'd be sitting on the edge of the bandstand, and he's beating his feet to the tunes and just doing all kinds of that, following everything and adding crazy stuff to it, But he was a music man from the word go. It was in his blood.
Well, he talks in some of the interviews that we have and some poems that we found, and of course in the autobiography, about these dances and getting in the car and going out with the group. But what struck us is that he also talked about barbershop singing, quartet singing, in connection with these. And of course, people don't do that nowadays. You don't drive around the car and sing, most of us don't, in 4-part harmony. Do you know any of that? You're not quite the same age as he is, but would that have been a common thing at the time? Well,
that was a thing to do in those days. I mean, riding cars and group dates, everybody was a little bit poor of money, so they grouped together and they sang and danced, and it was a group affair. So. And he was the leader of the groups.
Well, we kind of thought maybe. How did the family view his work in show business? This is something that we're asking particularly people who live in Savannah, because it's not the typical thing that a young man from Savannah, from a good family, would have done back at that time.
Well, he had a talent, and of course he always told us that he inherited his talent from his mother. Mm-hmm. He thought his mother was a very talented lady in the music field, and he had a love fest with his mother. They'd come home and be like sweethearts again. They were very proud of his attachment to the amusement industry, to music and stuff like that. Because, as we said, he went to do his thing on the stage, but he began making it bigger and bigger with radio and later on with Hollywood songwriting and lyric writing for movies and radio and TV, and so they were extremely proud of his activities and successes. There was nothing but pride, evidence in what he was doing. There was no stigma in the fact that he was on Broadway or trying to make it on Broadway.
Didn't they worry about him maybe a little bit? When you became affiliated with the firm, he was just beginning.
Just
actually
beginning. He had just gotten up to New York, maybe a year or so ahead of when I affiliated with the company. And as I said earlier, we were in the midst of the Depression, and his father was just trying to reconstitute his business after putting it into liquidation, his big firm in liquidation. So Mr. Mercer would write to Johnny from time to time and would try to slip him in some greenbacks. And Johnny used to kid when he would come to Savannah. He says, well, many times the mailman would come just as he was leaving, and he didn't have time to read the letter, so he would rip it open on the end and blow. And if there was anything green in there, he would then open the mail. Otherwise, he would wait until he returned before he started reading his daddy's letter. But if there was a greenback in there, he would immediately read it.
That's cute. Do you have any sense in these early days, before he became a success, how other folks in Savannah viewed this? I mean, it was a fairly small community still at the time.
Well, until the news began seeping down about his gaining popularity, especially when he started working with Paul Whiteman and with big names and appearing on the radios, especially Saturday nights, which used to be the big night on radio. When his notoriety became more apparent, everybody became interested in Johnny's success and his next step up the ladder.
We have telegrams that we recently received that he was on a Pontiac Youth Talent Contest on the radio. And apparently it was the first time that he'd been on the radio. And we had these really cute telegrams from his parents and from the brothers saying, we're going to be at Pop's house, we're going to be gathered around listening to you. And then another series saying, you were hot, you were good. So we know they were rooting for him.
Well, when he won his Oscar for Days in Wine and Roses, I wired him a telegram that congratulations. I said, now hop the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, come to Moon River, and let's have some days of wine and roses in the cool of the evening. And so he got a bang out of that, and he wired me back. He said, take the whole gang to Johnny Gannum's, which was a watering hole, and tell them the drinks are on me. That was his thank you for the message.
How is that name spelled? Johnny?
G-A-N-E-M.
Okay.
Gannum. Johnny Gannum.
The transcriber will appreciate your giving us the spelling. Over the years, he came back to Savannah.
Yes.
Really frequently. Who did he visit when he came? I mean, he came obviously for time out and vacation and all, but who did he visit?
He would when his mother was living, of course, she was home base. Mm-hmm. But he would visit friends like his friend Jack Kay, who was a prominent insurance man at the same age as Johnny.
And his last name is spelled?
C-A-Y.
C-A-Y. Okay.
Jack Kay's son, John Kay, is also a friend of Johnny's, but a lot younger. And he's head of a very large insurance firm, which was a family enterprise over 100 years, John Kay. Now, after Johnny's mother passed away, Johnny had purchased this home out on what's now Moon River. And so when they would come to town, they would naturally be there, and they would have guests with them, or they would visit their friends in the city. He would always come to Savannah, to my office whenever he would come to town. He'd touch base with us. And the last time when he was in England, collaborating with Andre Previn. He was asked by the physicians over there to return early because they detected that he was having some kind of a problem in his head. He was misstepping and sort of weaving, and they thought he might have some blockage in his brain. So Johnny came on back, never finished whatever he was doing with Previn, and he came to the office, and so I was asking him what his works were in connection with Previn. He said, "Well, Nick, I can't write any more lyrics for this generation." He says, "I am so disgusted with what they're calling lyrics and how nasty they are." He said, I can't write for this generation. And I said, "Oh, Johnny, you have been writing for 2.5 generations. Don't give up." And so he said, I rode from my mother's old house to your office, and there was only one tune on the radio, and it was Ugly Nasty, and it was just going up and down the scale, up and down, and all it was saying that I want it, I gotta have it, I need it, and then back down to the lower. He said, "What kind of lyrics are that? Why are they letting that go on the air?" Well, he was obviously very disgusted with what was being acceptable to this generation. But when he got to California, the doctors confirmed the British doctors' suspicion. He had a deep-rooted tumor. It was not cancerous, but it was so rooted until they could not get to it all. And so they removed as much as they could, but the unfortunate part was that which was left began growing again. And that eventually caused his demise.
Mm-hmm. What did Mrs. Mercer, how did Mrs. Mercer fit in with Savannah? She's a Yankee. She's from New York City.
Oh, Mrs. Mercer, she was a doll. You're talking about Ginger.
Right.
Well.
Sorry, that Mrs. Mercer.
Yeah. Her people also were from Jacksonville, Florida, too.
Oh, were they?
Yeah.
Oh, we didn't know that.
Yeah. And she has sisters, relatives up in the Atlanta area now. They attended the night when Johnny Mercer was put into the Hall of Fame posthumously. Mm-hmm. Ginger's relatives were up there too, some from Jacksonville and some from the Atlanta area. Mm-hmm. So she wasn't all a Yankee girl. I think she had gone up there too to make it on Broadway. Did you have indication that she was a Yankee?
Well, she was raised in Brooklyn, in New York City. So that's pretty Yankee.
Yeah. The possibility was that some of her people then settled in Jacksonville, you know, in the Atlanta area. She probably was in that Brooklyn.
Yeah, our information is that she was raised in Brooklyn.
Yeah. But she had connections in Jacksonville and also in the Atlanta area.
I'm sure that would have made it easier.
Yeah.
And all we could think
But she was, you know, there was no problem with Ginger or whoever was a friend of Johnny was a friend of Ginger's in Savannah, you know, there was no stiffness at all.
That's nice.
Matter of fact, Johnny brought his daughter Amanda to Savannah to introduce her to society.
Oh, he did?
Yeah.
But when was that?
Well, it was, I guess, in
around 58, maybe?
Something like that. You know, he adopted Amanda and Jeff. Mm-hmm. And one of the two Mercer girls and Amanda were presented to society that same night. And Johnny brought 2 bands from New York to play at the ball. One band was a black band, and the other band, I forget which one it was, but they would alternate. And there was never an intermission for the lack of music. Johnny brought his two bands down, and it was a great night. But he brought Amanda back to his hometown to present it to.
And so that she would have come out with one of her cousins then.
Yeah, she.
Now, which cousin might this have been?
I'm thinking maybe it could have been Ann.
Okay.
The young lady you interviewed yesterday.
Right. Where was it
If you
held?
talk to her at the old DeSoto Hotel, which was a great place, and unfortunately, we tore it down like we tore the city market down. But if you next I see Ann, I'll ask her, did she remember who were the cousins that were presented on the same evening?
Because we'd heard that from somebody else, but we'd never heard it at all before. And I'm glad you mentioned it, because now we know that it really did happen. Getting back to Mr. Mercer's parents, now his father had this real estate company. Was that the main thing that he did for a living up until, let's say, up before the bankruptcy? Was that his main living, or we heard he was a lawyer?
Johnny's father graduated from University of Georgia as a lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
and he practiced law in the beginning, but then as he was handling legal matters in connection with real estate involvements, he became enamored in the possibilities of development in real estate, and so his emphasis was away from law and more into real estate. But he never gave up his license to practice law, and he also was a person devoted to the orphanage in Savannah, to the Bethesda orphanage. And Mr. Mercer Sr. was president of the Union Society, which ran the orphanage for 30 years. And periodically he would run ads at his expense that says, if you will leave something in your will to Bethesda, I'll draw your will without charge. So he could still practice law,
Mm-hmm.
and yet he was concentrating on real estate.
Can you tell us, we knew that the company went bankrupt, but we never knew what the investment was that went bad, or what series of investments. Do you know what he had invested in that failed?
His company never went bad. The truth is that it was on solid grounds. Mr. Mercer saw what was happening in the way of mountain areas, and he would invest the certificate money into mountain areas, and then into Florida areas, and into commercial ventures. He built the first apartment house in Savannah. He built it, which is still standing, Forsyth Apartments, facing the Confederate monument here. But his venture was solid. Now, when depression hit bottom and everybody was running on the banks, drawing the money out as fast as they could until the banks just closed their doors, the certificate holders start making a run on the Mercer Company too. Well, the banks would go bankrupt, and then some of the officers would reconstitute themselves. The depositors might be lucky to get 10 and 20 cents on the dollar. Mr. Mercer says, hey, we don't have the money to pay the certificate holders, but we've got good, hard investments, mountain areas, Florida areas, commercial areas. We are not going to bankrupt. He could have made a ton of money if he had bankrupt and then bought it back and wiped them all out for 20 cents on the dollar. But he says, this is not the way to go. I'm going to put this corporation into an orderly liquidation. And as the market rises and the revenues come in, we'll be able to systematically pay off, but we can't pay them on demand today. So that's when he put the G.A. Mercer Company into liquidation, and systematically it did exactly what he had suggested. They had paid back 82 cents on the dollar at the time, and Johnny made that fabulous thing of paying the rest of it off to the certificate holders because he had made himself the promise. You know the story.
Yeah. Let's hold while I flip this over. We're getting real close here. Right, it was in the 50s then that he paid off the $300,000.
It was approximately $300,000, and of course, a lot of people say, well, Johnny made money on Capitol Records, and he's going to charge that off to his taxes, and the government is going to be paying most of that too, which was absolutely false because you cannot buy a debt of somebody else's and charge it off to your taxes. So
no.
That was not a tax ploy. It was actually something that Johnny had promised himself at the time that Daddy was putting his company into liquidation. And of course, you know my story on it. I tried to get Johnny not to do that because I thought his father and mother's name would be perpetuated with scholarships in colleges in their memory. But he says, well, you're speaking with your head, but I'm speaking with the heart. And when I looked into that statement, I found out that he had promised himself that if he ever made it, nobody who bet on his father would lose 1 cent. That was speaking with the heart.
Yes, it was. It's a very honorable thing to do as well. Oh, let's see here. Well, there's a lot more. I think I may be at the end of my questions for the time being. We've covered a lot of territory here. Can you tell me when he last visited Savannah? Was that the time that he came after he'd come back from England?
That was the last time he visited Savannah, and as I say, he came to visit me at the office. His brother was at that time deceased, Walter, and I was head of the firm. And he had benefacted the Jenkins Boys Club in the process of paying off the certificate holders. He then inherited what was left in the G.M. Mercer Company. The bank president, Mr. Hunt, said, now what do you want done with the residue? And he says, Mr. Hunt, what the hell is residue? He says, that's what's left over. And Johnny took his pencil out and on the back of an envelope wrote residue. And Mr. Hunt said, well, I'll tell you later on what the residue is. John said, I don't care about what's the residue. I want to remember that word because sometimes I might want to use it in some lyrics. So whenever he would hear a word like that, sometimes it impressed him and he would write it down. But because there was $45,000 left as residue, he asked us to let it sit for a while and he decided what to do with it. And eventually he gave $15,000 to the Crippled Children Hospital in Atlanta, the Elks, and $15,000 to his Episcopal bishop for the diocese work in Savannah. And then the last 15 he gave it to the Jenkins Boys Club for the gym, which they named in honor of his father. Well, when Johnny went to the hospital over in California for his surgery, we were having a county fair, which the Exchange Club, the sponsor of the Boys Club, had every year. And so there was a card prepared, a 3 by 6 foot card that folded in half. And all the boys from the Boys Club and people come into their booth at the fair, signed Get Well Johnny card. And we mailed it over to California, and they set it up in the hospital for him. But that was an appreciation for his benefaction of the gym for the Jenkins Boys Club.
How did he come to be interested in that Boys Club specifically? Had the family been interested in it before?
Well, his brother was one of the lead members of the Exchange Club of Savannah, which sponsored the Boys Club, and had been president for a couple of terms. So naturally, Walter was interested in the founding the Boys Club. I also became a trustee of the Boys Club. And so we had built a brand new building at that time, a gym building, and we were struggling to pay off the last of the mortgage. So Johnny came to town to visit his mother and had a day extra on his schedule, so we asked him to look at the Boys Club, and we went there in the middle of summer. The swimming pool was jumping, the basketball courts were full of boys, and the game rooms, shooting pool and reading, and he saw a bunch of activity, and he just said, how much you own on this gym? I said, approximately $15,000. And he said, market paid. Market paid. Well, that was because his brother and I were with him, and we were interested in the Boys Club, and he had this dangling there. So he said, market paid. So we paid off the gym building. And he came down on a subsequent visit and spoke to the Boys Club in the gym building. That was the night we dedicated to his father.
There's a high school also. Is that dedicated to his father?
His grandfather. Johnny came for the dedication and later spoke to the students. And in the process afterwards, there were a lot of questions and answers. And one of the young ladies said, Mr. Mercer, what does it take to be a lyric writer? And Johnny looked at us and says, darling, read, read, read. That's what it takes. Read a lot, and don't read just love stories. Read a lot, the classics. Read about the Wild West. He said, for instance, he tells her, I wrote, I'm an old cowhand from the Rio Grande, but I'd never been on a pony or a horse or on a ranch. But I had read Wild West stories. And says you must read, and you must look up new words that you're not familiar with. But read a lot, and then be inquisitive about the meaning of words, which is a wonderful reply to a young lady who was interested in what it takes to be a lyric writer.
It is. One of the women that we interviewed earlier said that he was like a sponge. And she said everywhere you went, he'd suddenly get tickled because of something he'd seen or something he'd heard. And like you said, he'd write it down.
Yeah.
Or just remember it. And she said you never knew when, but sometime later, whatever it was that he'd heard or that had lodged in his brain would come out in a song.
If you read his lyrics, you'd be amazed that some of his stuff leads to physics, and some leads to astronomy, aurora borealis,
Mm-hmm.
when a immovable object meets a so it was fantastic. But if he heard something new and he wasn't sure of the meaning, he'd write it down and look it up, and file it. And of course, he wrote the Song of India, and he's never been to India, but if you read the poetry in that song, you'd think that he was raised in India,
Absolutely beautiful.
Beautiful.
Beautiful lyric. I think we've about covered it. If you wanted to, or if you had a last thought to add to what we've already said today, what might occur to you? It's a hard question, I know.
Well, having been with the family so many years, Johnny was a very warm person. And when he would come to town, he was just a regular fellow. He didn't want any commotion. My wife met him one day in the grocery store. He was shopping for his mother, and he was there with his floppy shoes and socks and unshaven. And so, of course, Anna knew Johnny, and she slid up to him carefully and said, hello, Mr. Mercer. And he said, and so he said, how are you? How's Ginger? He says, fine, fine. And so periodically when they would come around the holidays, my wife would pass some Greek sweets, and Johnny dearly loved them. So at that particular time, it was sort of summertime, and the holidays were at here. And so Anna said, I don't have any Greek sweets right now, but when are you coming? And she said, well, I think I'll be here in Christmas with Ginger. So they did come, and so Anna fixed them all kind of fancy sweets, including some with a lot of powdered sugar on them. And when we took it to them on Moon River, he immediately wanted to go into it. And Ginger said, Johnny, we got this 4 o'clock reception, and don't you go to eating sweets right now. And besides, you can get that sugar all over your clothes. And he said, well, I'm just going to take one. And by the time he took one, all that sugar was all this box. But anyway, Anna knew Johnny, and so she slid up to him and says, well, I'm glad to see you. Ginger didn't come with him at that particular time, and they exchanged some visits, but he didn't want much commotion. But that was Johnny. He would visit his friends, and they would have sometimes some pretty raucous visits. Sometimes it was just friendly visits, but he was just a good Joe, really was. And he had a lot of real good qualities that came out of his religious background. Like, he could be crazy as an entertainer and everything else, but when it came down to fundamentals, Johnny was a high type person. His entire family was with that reputation, just honorable people, and he wouldn't veer away from that. His life recorded the fact that he respected the honorable issues of life.
Well, I thank you for sharing your thoughts today, and appreciate having the chance to talk with you.
Well, it's good to see you, Chris, really. I don't know how much we've added to what you already know, but...
Oh, you've added a lot. Thank you.